I love training. I love educating and furthering and expanding people's repertoires of their knowledge. And I feel like we provide a service to the industry. We provide things that people may not be able to find elsewhere. Construction-specific education that helps people expand their business and giving them pathways to attain a license. You give a man a fish, he only eats a day. You teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime. So I love that idea, and I love helping people kind of achieve their dreams.
Welcome to episode 115 of the AFT Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Levitt. And in this episode, I speak with Rachel Doty of the Contractor Training Center. And Rachel is the director of course development there, and she is also a contractor herself. She's the VP of Blevens Construction. And I was really excited to have Rachel on. She is very versed as far as construction, starting a business. What does it take to understand licensing in your state? What does it mean when a contractor says licensed, bonded, and insured? What does the bonding part mean? What are the insurance requirements that you should have and you should require of your subcontractors? How do you write the contracts? Where do you start? Especially when it gets down into lien waivers and billing. And so this is something that she offers. Her course there at the Contractor Training Center, they have the documentation, they have the paperwork, they help you get started in the construction world. And they even have a code right now for everyone listening, AFT-15. So you go in to the website that's here in the show notes, type in AFT-15. They will give you a 15% discount on their course, on their brochures, on all their product. So I definitely recommend checking them out. You're going to love this episode. Rachel has a wealth of knowledge. So without further ado, let's get started.
So welcome to the AFT Construction Podcast. And today we have Rachel Doty with us. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. So great to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on. And Rachel is the director of course development at the Contractor Training Center, which we're going to dive into because there's a lot of technical things that you're assisting with us contractors. But maybe we start here. I mean, Rachel, you're super involved in the industry and the business. And so what issues, trends are you seeing face the industry right now?
Right now, a lot of contractors are talking about material shortages and delays in sourcing and delivering materials, and also labor shortages. I mean, with everything going on with unemployment and trying to find good help, it's troublesome for a lot of guys to try to get good help that want to work, that want to show up and, have everything kind of have some experience. So it's a little bit of a problem, people trying to build homes and renovate them because it's hard to keep up with demand. There's so much demand right now, but not as much in terms of supply and labor.
Yeah, and that's I'm trying to get my hands around that. I've been building now as a professional outside of college for 16 years. I've been involved in the industry my whole life. I can't ever recall a time such as this where we're trying to figure out supply chain. As much as you think, okay, we know there's an issue, let's order in advance, it still doesn't matter. Like we have projects that we're ordering stuff 8 months in advance and it's still not coming in and it's still being pushed. And, vendors and suppliers can't provide any assurity, any timelines that are accurate. And for the first time, I've had some conversation with clients. Like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. We're pushing on this. Hopefully it'll be done. We had a client just move in and typically the house is 100% done. It's toothbrush ready, as we say, furniture, everything. They bring their toothbrush, maybe their wardrobe, and they're good. And, it's a working house. We still have a lot of elements and it's just, it's something unique that we've never dealt with before.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging trying to adapt. And having to adapt quickly where you've never had these issues before and you generally have a timeline of how long something's going to take, but then, you just don't know if you're going to get the materials. You just don't know if they're going to come through.
Yeah. And so what do you recommend? I mean, in commercial, it's very common in commercial construction, especially in the initial contract and the project, that when you're doing commercial, whether it be a restaurant, whether it be a hotel, right? There is strict guidelines of schedule because liquidated damages, right? If the business isn't open, there's delay costs. I know like a Walmart, every day late, you're charged a substantial amount because they have their trucks ready en route to supply, all the product in the Walmart. But whereas in residential, we don't really have liquidated damages, but what are you seeing happen with contractors right now in regard to litigation, right? And issues they may be having legally, whether it be with delays or price increases or in their contract not having escalation clauses?
Yes, that's a big thing where you don't have any clause that protects you for the material increase or for instance, if there was a code change, the increased cost of compliance. So it's troublesome where, I mean, a lot of contractors, I've seen a lot of the big builders, they're just giving, here's a $20,000 price increase because our cost of supply is going up. If you want to keep the house and keep it under contract, here's your change order, sign it. If not, we'll sell it to somebody else. And people are either paying up or they're walking away. And right now, the way the market is, they're not walking away. So that's beneficial on behalf of the contractors, that there's such a demand that they can kind of dictate that. But it's, if you're already in contract with somebody and you're already delayed and already in that, getting into that liquidated damages sort of realm, I mean, you could be in breach. Technically, it could be considered breach, especially if you have a dedicated time frame of delay. So, I mean, there are obviously extenuating circumstances. An attorney would come in on your behalf and say that there was no possible feasible way to complete it. So it may take experts saying, this is just the market demand right now. This is unprecedented. So I think that the way it'll play out, I'm sure there will be people that try to get out, especially if there's a bubble that bursts here soon, and then everyone can't afford the interest rate hikes on things. But, right now we're not seeing it as much. People are they want the house, they'll pay it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So outside of, the escalation clause and outside of price increases that a lot of us are dealing with, in customers, and it's not just, unique to us in construction. The funny thing about the economy right now is, we have clients and we have peers that own restaurants, right? And their restaurants are half full and they're like, hey, this isn't because of COVID. We're not separating people. It's because we don't have any staff. We don't have, the amount of produce and the amount of product we need, right, to serve. And so we can only have a limited amount of people because we only have those many servers and then, the kitchen staff. And so it's really created a limitation. And I think most people that are fairly reasonable, that are at least somewhat in tune with the economy, at least client-wise, they hopefully understand that this isn't unique to just us contractors and our inability to perform, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. That hopefully it doesn't fall back on, because it's happening to everyone. It's broad-based. It's not like one contractor's cranking work out and everyone else is just slacking. So, I mean.
Right. So what, with all your experience, especially working with contractors, I mean, what is the most common, or what are some of the other litigation issues that we should be aware of? If we're starting a business for the first time, working with certain clientele, whether it be remodels or new builds, where do most contractors have a challenge just looking at the legal aspect of their business?
A lot of times people, what I've seen over over recent years would be mostly construction defects, where there's stucco issues or water intrusion, failures on exterior fenestration, exterior envelope assemblies. There's been a lot on that. But as far as contracts, the contract disputes, mostly on the lien side of things, not filing things properly, not paying off the subs properly, making sure that all of your releases are in place so there's no liens on the homes. There's a lot of lien foreclosure issues where, you get into, that's something to always consider, but just making sure that that's taken care of. But on the other side of things, construction accidents. You have a lot of construction safety issues, whether it's somebody falling off of a ladder or somebody stepping on something, a homeowner stepping on a nail after a roof has been done. You didn't get all the roofing nails up. So there's always that inherent negligence or the inherent wrongful death. I mean, God forbid someone's diabetic and steps on a nail, then it's a whole calamity of issues. But so it's those things, the safety issues, the lien filings, and then just proper workmanship, following the code, and sometimes exceeding the code is the best way to avoid some of those things, because even if you're just following the code to the basic minimum, you can still have issues with stucco and fenestration assemblies because, depending on the climate. So.
I love that you point out those three things. I want to touch upon all three of those because a lot of times I'm asked, what keeps me up at night? And I'm like, it's pretty much everything. I mean, as a contractor, there's so much risk in everything we do. And, we're exposed throughout the entire build. And, you think about it, there's a podcast I was listening to, and Rusty from Beach and Barn, he made a great analogy. It's the first time I'd heard this, and he said, when you're in manufacturing, whether you're buying a vehicle, whether you're buying clothing, apparel, whatever it may be, that's behind closed doors. And yes, there's OSHA and there's regulations on the floor, right, for everybody, but you're in an enclosed area. And, so for someone like me that's maybe buying a shirt or a car, I'm not going to see how it's made, right? I'm not in the factory behind the scenes seeing everything put together. What's unique about construction is now you're putting the manufacturing facility right for everybody to look at and walk through. So clients, if it's a remodel, you're building the manufacturing facility right there in front of them, right? In their houses, they're living there. Or if you're doing a new build and clients are coming by every day and now trades. And so you think of that exposure. That's one thing to train your immediate staff or those that are, close. But as you get farther down the chain link there, to everyone that's touching and delivering and clients walking through, the exposure is exponential. And it's a really good point you make about just, the construction safety, because it impacts so many outside of us, even our immediate training that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Ladders, your top 4 ladders, unprotected surfaces and edges.
Digging a pool shock, and maybe not having it safed off, any safety netting or anything.
Trenching and shoring. Yep. Those are all huge things. And a lot of trades deal with that, electricians will deal with it, plumbers will deal with it, pool guys will deal with it. So there's just lots of things.
And as you work with contractors, as you're consulting around the country, lien waivers are really important. I look at this in Phoenix. Phoenix is a little bit more of a regulated market as far as, for us, a lot of times we're working with a bank or even the clients we're working with are very savvy. And so for us, we're doing, unconditional and conditional lien waivers, right? And so we're filing a lien, a pre-construction lien at the beginning of the project. And then every pay application, we're turning in all liens. And so this is very documented and common. Is that common throughout the country? Are there different markets that don't require that? Where's the struggle there with some of the contractors that may not fully grasp the importance of understanding their rights to file a pre-construction lien, as well as making sure that they have lien releases as they're paying their subs and suppliers throughout the course of the project?
So each state's different when it comes to lien law. They all have a basic premise of that. Some are more lax than others, but most still require, where you call it one, you call it, I guess, notice of a construction lien, perhaps in Arizona.
Yeah.
In Florida, it's called a notice to owner. In Virginia, they call it a memorandum of lien. So there's a lot of different terminology when it comes to that. And each state is different and intrinsically different on the time frames. We have, prior to the job, 60 days prior to, after the completion of the work. Others, it's 45 days. Others, it's 90 days. So knowing those time frames and knowing what the terms are called, when they call it a partial lien waiver or it's a partial release or they call it, some other combination of names. Each state's different. And especially if you're a multi-state contractor and you're working in different states, having to know the differences between that is just crucial, because you could be leaving money on the table or not even being able to recover any of those things. You've completely lost all of your lien rights and waived your lien rights just by lack of filing a notice to owner in some states. Barred from future recovery. So it's super important to have somebody in the office that knows those things. Maybe if it's not the contractor, maybe the project manager, maybe someone in the office staff that handles, payments, to know when all the payments have been received, to check against materials that have been ordered, to make sure that the materials have been separately, signed off. If that's the case, sometimes you have to have material sign off separate from labor sign off. So that's huge to be able to have someone know those things, and in between states especially is important.
I'm glad you share that, because what I think most builders don't realize, especially when they're starting out. I know in Arizona, for example, when you're doing commercial construction, the trade partners can file a mechanic lien against the vendor or against the client. The GC can. Residential is a little unique. When you're doing residential, what's tough for the trade partners, they don't have a lot of lien rights in Arizona, right, to file against the client. They can against the GC only if the GC has filed a pre-construction lien, right, to notify the state, hey, we're doing this work, here's the contract amount. And so if we as the GC in residential, if we're not filing that notice, right, to the state and everybody. If the client doesn't pay us coming into the project, we didn't follow that, we're out of luck. I mean, we have no right to lien the house because we didn't notify the client that we, we're registering the project, if you will. And so,
and the filing requirements with where they have to file it, the clerk
right.
of court.
And as you mentioned, you have a certain timeline. I believe, here I'm on the podcast, but I believe it's 6 months. I'm pretty sure that when we're, if we haven't been paid, that we have within 6 months to file a lien, if that's the case, by the end of the project, if we haven't been paid and work is complete, substantial complete, per the contract. And, as long as we're following our aspect, right, our side of the contract and making sure that's all laid out. And what's really important, and you alluded to this earlier, especially when you start thinking about insurance and liability and getting into the, defective product, or especially with the envelope, which is really difficult because, a lot of us do work with engineers, and architects are qualified. Sometimes you may work with a draftsman, and so you don't know the qualification of either the draftsman or the professionals, consultants that they're hiring. And so these details become crucial because if we're installing details that are incorrect, and whether it be with the foundation and the soils report, or whether it be with the envelope and, water that enters the building, down the road, it can create some major aspects for us and issues as the builder.
Definitely.
And so how do you, like when you're working, Rachel, when you're consulting a contractor around the country, and you're trying to walk them through these 3 items, whether it's defective construction, whether it's, lien waivers, whether it's construction safety, what do you recommend? Where do they start? Because every state's so different. How are you up to speed? How do you where do you start that process?
Well, it depends on the code for the state. So that's the first thing. I mean, you in most states, they use the international codes. Some states have their own state modified versions. So knowing what the code is and explaining to them how to understand the code, how to read the code in context with their project is first. Second, on the lien law issue, each state has their own lien statutes and lien rules. So you just locate those statutes, you locate those rules, you can explain to these people how, explain to the contractors how these things work within their state. And usually most of the time, once we show them and we explain to them where these are located, they you teach a man to fish. So we taught him how to fish. Now we can read the code and the statutes, and he can kind of interpret it. Some need a little bit more, or they read into it a lot, and they really want to know why it says this and why it's so prescriptive in nature, or how we meet this performance requirement. So, you kind of get into some people that, are of the detail-oriented variety that like to make sure that they are dotting their I's and crossing their T's. So you have those, that you have to explain the exceptions and explain why they're exceptions and in which cases they would be exceptions and how footnotes work.
Well, it's interesting. So when you're consulting and you're working through that, it's you're helping them understand where to find the statutes and what's, the legalities of the area they're working in. But how often do you run into a contractor that's not working with a contract, whether it's a owner prime contract or a subcontractor contract, right? How often are you running into that? Because I know just from experience, some contractors have a contract for everything and some are a little bit more lackadaisical when it comes to the contracting side.
So some states require written contracts if you're dealing with residential property renovations over a certain dollar amount, if it's over $50 or over $2,500. But there are some trades where it's not structural in nature, or it doesn't require a contract, and then it's up to workmanlike standards. So what is workmanlike standards? What would the standard contractor do in the commencement of a quality project? So in Arizona specifically, you have written workmanlike standards that you have to follow. What's an acceptable tolerance? What's the general practice, and what's not an allowed practice? So Arizona is very specific in nature in that they say what is allowed and what's not. If you have a difference in your threshold height at your doorway that's more than 1/4 of an inch, for instance, I don't know, I'm just off the top of the head, but
yeah.
Then that's an acceptable tolerance. But it's more than 1/4 of an inch, then it's a defect. So that would be like an attorney's like gold mine. Oh my gosh, it's specific and it says what the workmanlike standards are. But in other states, it's very vague. So you have to use industry practice, industry standards. Sometimes there's books and recommendations for exams that you have to that you have to practice those books and understand how it's written in those books, and that can be considered an industry reference or an industry standard. Although maybe it's not a code required standard or code required publication, it's just a suggested, recommendation of how you should install something like that. So that would be like an example of just how a contractor who doesn't have necessarily a by the book contract that has to follow the code, letter to the law. There's not plans and specifications that they have to follow from the architect. How they would just go about creating quality work while still avoiding that kind of exposure, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I do know that in Arizona, which is a little unique, as you mentioned, we have what's called the ROC, the Registrar of Contractors. And, when you get licensed, you have to take the exam, pass, and then you're on the website and you have a license number and everything. We pay the registrar, right, to be registered with them. And then, of course, if there's a dispute or there's, a craftsmanship issue, whatever it may be, defective work, as you mentioned, right, then the client can file a claim with the ROC. They have an inspector that comes out, almost, working between the two parties to look at it and say, yeah, this is within tolerance. It's not within tolerance. Here's a correction. And so there is that correct method, if you will. Ideally, hopefully you don't have to get lawyers involved, that you can, resolve these items peacefully, because that's always a good thing to not have to pay the lawyers all the money, right? And work through that. But I can imagine that's really difficult, especially when you're working in other states, though, for contractors, when it's a little bit more open-ended and there's a little bit more, maybe there's not protection for the client. I feel like in Arizona that the client does have a lot of protection, because they can go to the ROC and they have someone behind them to make sure that the contractor is being held up to the standard they should be.
Yes, definitely. And that a contractor has to include that language, that they have the understanding that they can collect on that in their contract. So that's another thing too, that another point to bring up. There's a lot of required contract provisions that have to be in the contract when you do have a written contract. Notice for a recovery fund, a transaction recovery fund, for example, lien law notices. So, and a contractor who doesn't have that in their contract, now you could be in violation. You could be subject to disciplinary action. So you have to make sure when a contract is needed, a written contract. Although in most states, oral contracts are allowed, depending on the type of work. Knowing when it's needed to be written and what has to be included on that contract is definitely of importance.
Yeah, and I'll say, even if orally contracts are allowed in the state you're in, I mean, here's the reality. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of projects, a lot of discussions. Changes are happening. On these jobs, it's very complex. And it's really easy. We found that the more dialed in we are in regard to scope, right, the more details we have for our trade partners that are bidding, and we really diagnose the scope. One of the things we've done, especially over the years, is when we, sending out bid docs that you go through and you write down all the scope. So everyone's working apples to apples. And what ends up happening is we found that it's less opportunity for error, right? We send that scope to the client, the trade partner has it, we have it. So everyone's on the same page. So that way, if someone says, oh, I didn't have this in my bid, or, I'm missing this, at least we have something there. So as much as we trust one another, look, we forget things, conversations happen, we interpret it differently, and it happens way too often.
Definitely. And having them submit in, if you are having multiple subs bid on a project, having them submit in shop drawings with specific, what are they including? What gauge metal are they using? How are they, terminating this penetration point? What specific materials are they using? Because then you can also narrow down if they're just trying to submit the cheap bid because they're only using one layer of something, or using a cheaper metal versus using what you really want it to be spec to. And having those details in the bid docs is huge too, because then you say, well, we need 26 gauge aluminum here, whatever.
I love that you share that, Rachel, because this is something I think as you've been in business for a long time and we've become more experienced, I look back at our career and especially as a company and the mistakes we've made. And it could be something as easy as a threshold. We had experience with a client where, they had selected a threshold for the multi-slider. Fast forward through construction, we installed it as directed, as selected, and the client didn't like it. And there are a few reasons why they didn't like it. And, the comment the client made is like, hey, you should have known to explain this more in detail, how this would look. And I'm like, well, it's really tough as a builder to really anticipate and forecast, like there's a million things going in, every little thing that's going to trip up the client. But I will say moving forward, I mean, this is something that we're going to address on every project. And you think about like a disclaimer that, hey, if you want this certain threshold, you need to sign a disclaimer because it's going to protrude. It's going to be above the finished floor instead of level and flush. And here's why. And so it's these little things you refine that. And I've noticed that, especially as you're working with natural stone, that the client may see a sample, maybe 12 inch by 12 inch, and maybe 24 inch by 24 inch. But by the time you receive 5,000 square feet of product, depending on where it's cut in the mountain, it could be different. And so dye lots change, blends change. And so those disclaimers are really important when we're working with natural products. And, all of us become more refined as we've made these mistakes. And now it's just more informative for the client, so that we're communicating better, throughout the process.
Yeah. And going off of that, actually, not just showing like this, not talking about just the size, but a lot, especially with the marble, some people will complain about the texture of it having too many holes or too many variations, which is, they have to understand that's a natural occurrence in natural stone, in marble, in travertine, in whatever, specific finish they may have. Even pavers will sometimes have some of those variations. And so a homeowner may think there's a defect when in fact that is exactly the way that it was intended. And they just don't know what that finished product's going to look like,
Yeah, I love that you share that because that's something we deal with regularly. I can assure you, especially with the homes that we do. And one thing I've seen too that's really important, and you said this earlier, Rachel, is when whether it be the type of metal, the type of aluminum, the products that the client we found very successful, especially with the cabinet color, right? If we have a custom finish, then we'll take the sample that's approved and cut in 3 pieces, right? We have sometimes 4 pieces because we'll have one for us as the builder, one for the client, one for the cabinet company, possibly one for the designer too. So 4 parties have a piece here that we can use as our template. And one thing that's we have to do in our communities, our HOA, the homeowners organization, we have to do mock-ups. So for example, with exterior finishes, we have to build an actual temporary wall that has the stucco finish, that has the brick, the stone, the roof tile, right? The paint color that's integrated into the color of the stucco. So all these things are installed and that stays on site full time so that come end of the project, client can inspect it, the HOA can inspect it and make sure that, yes, we installed what we originally planned to do.
It's kind of a good CYA, actually, having those job site mock-ups available, because then you can just direct a homeowner, this is what it's going to look like. So go take a look at those finishes. Let me know if that's what you want. You have these 3 colors to choose from, So.
And one thing I'll say, don't throw it away too early because it's funny. We actually had the mock-up done. It was signed off by the HOA on another project. The color was approved. Everything was exactly per the spec. You fast forward 30 days, and then when you paint, the fascia, the color, the roof tiles installed, the way the light and the sunlight reflects, it just looked different. It looked more yellow. And the client's like, hey, this looks way different. And the original mock-up we had thrown away because we're making room for landscaping and the pool. And so one thing we realized too, hey, we're just going to wait till the very end because we ended up taking care of it for the client. But at the same time, there was no basis there, even though it had been done and signed off at the time. Things change as other finishes go on and how that light reflects. And so, as we said early on, right, there's a lot of risk for us as the builder, and that's where we need Rachel. Now, we're super excited to welcome one of our new sponsors to the podcast, Pella Windows. And this is even more exciting because we use Pella in so many of our projects, nearly all of them. And they've been just an incredible partner of ours. And locally, Sammy and Adam, they are not only amazing business partners behind us, but they are super close friends. And I speak on the podcast all the time about the importance of relationships, right? Relationships with our customers, with our vendors, with our suppliers, because at the end of the day, I'm only as good as those that help our brand and assist us in our projects to take it from the ground up all the way to completion. And if we didn't have partners such as Pella, there's no way we'd be who we are today. Over the years, we've built this amazing relationship. When we call them or email them, they respond. They're quick. Their company culture, their integrity, their honesty, they are always there to do what's right for us and the customer. They can do anything from small replacement projects to large custom homes and even multi-million-dollar commercial projects. And also, when you think about their product line, they can do ultra contemporary, historical preservation, and large traditional projects. So for anyone, any scale, any size, they're the ones to call. They're here local. They have an amazing Instagram. Make sure and give them a follow to see what they're doing. So if you need windows and doors, give Sammy and Adam a call. We stand behind Pella. We love what they do, their culture, their brand, and especially their quality. And if you want to learn more about Pellet Windows, check our show notes. We'll have everything tagged there so you can give them a follow and have their contact information to reach out. And now let's get back into the episode. When you're thinking about starting a business, as you work with companies starting businesses, and we talked about a lot of the risk, and where else should a contractor focus, when they're starting their business?
There's a lot of things to consider. Like when they're first starting out, if they haven't already set up a business, there's a lot of things that they're going to need to know to kind of figure out before they just jump into it. What type of work they've been doing, what their experience is in, what type of work they want to do. Because it really depends on how their experience is in specific types of structural work for what type of license they may qualify for. Just because they want to, get a roofing license, if they've never laid roofs, they may not go get the license because they won't have the experience. But, and then also taking a look at, your personal, and if you already have a business set up, your business financial statements, what situation you may be in, if you have a business set up, what does your bottom line look like? What are your financials like? We've actually, a lot of guys ask us this, where do I start? Where do I get started in this business? I don't, I want to become a contractor. I'm working for a guy. I'm sick of working for the man. I want to go get my own license, so we've been working on creating a manual for that. So how to simplify the whole process, explains to people where to start, basically just a contractor startup toolkit manual, how to start, manage, and scale your construction or trades business. So it takes you through how to set up your business, from your ideas, your trade names, the testing and the licensing process, all the way through how to manage and expand your business. If you want to specialize in a niche market, if you want to be general and just do all residential, if you just want to do one specific, subtrade like cabinet installation. So, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different facets. One license, you can do a lot of things, but just because you have that license doesn't mean you're going to be everyone's everything. It may be better for you to specialize and choose a field that you can niche into, because then you can be the best at that niche instead of being okay on everything, just being mediocre at a lot of things versus being, the craftsman in a specific subtrade. So
I'm glad you shared that, because the reality is in every state's different on their classification of licensing, right? And for us, even though we may have in Arizona what's called a B1 license, we're able to do government work or commercial residential. That may be the case, but we can't self-perform certain aspects, right? Certain life safety. I mean, there's classification of codes and scope of work that I can't self-perform unless I'm qualified, go through the testing, and get licensed for that. And then, if you're to look up the ROC, the registrar website, the government website, you can see all the classifications that I've been approved for as a qualifying party. And so I would imagine there's a lot of education you have to give to contractors to understand that aspect, to make sure that they're working within their scope of work that they've been legally approved to do so.
Right. And knowing what the scope of work is, it's sometimes hard to track down where all those license scopes are, what specific sub classifications require that,
Yeah, and I'll give a good example to that, because again, not throwing anyone on a bus, but I know there's a vendor in town that, for their classification, they're in the masonry scope. And so, when they're doing pavers, and exterior brickwork and masonry work, they're licensed to do that. But like vertical stone in like the interior of a house, that they're not approved for, but they do work, they bid it. And fortunately, I have a very good, and I think this is really key, I have a very good legal person on my side that anytime we're going to contract or bid a new, we have a pre-qual kit that we send out to, potential trade partners. And in that, they list the scopes of work that they'll perform. And my legal guy goes through and he checks their licensing and ROC and says, hey, Brad, they can do X, Y, and Z, but they can't do A, that they're bidding because they're not licensed for it. And that's where we have to be careful as a general contractor as well to make sure who we're hiring.
Definitely. It's interesting you say that, though, because in some states, I don't know if it's the case in Arizona, some states allow you to contract for work or for scopes of work that you're not necessarily licensed to do, as long as you subcontract it to the respective party. So even if there are multiple aspects of a job that fall under, say, an engineering classification or roofing classification, because you have the majority of the work, you can contract for it and just sub it out to those respective trades. I don't know if that's the case in Arizona, or if you have to subcontract each thing individually. They allow you to act as a prime contractor where the majority of the work is within your scope.
Yeah, so we act as the primary contractor, but then, if I want to do electrical, for example, like I can't go install or have my super, I have to subcontract electrical company. And so, and this is another important point. I mean, when you start thinking about development, right? So what's unique about Arizona is like a homeowner, if you own your house, Rachel, and it's your own house, you can contract, those to work on your house. You can contract your own electrician, your own plumber to work under you as a homeowner. But if you're a developer, let's say you own like 3 spec houses and you're an investor, you can't, as a spec, investor, you can't hire an electrician to work on all 3 of your specs, because at that point you have to be a licensed contractor. So it's only if it's your own home can you contract without being the prime contractor or having a license, as the GC.
Interesting.
And so that's where it's important too that we educate the public that, I know that, there's designers that don't have their license that are hiring subcontractors, and that's where it gets really messy, because for the client to not understand, hey, my designer or my architect who's hiring subs to do my remodel, legally they're not able to, so there's no recourse for them at the end of the day, right? And that's where it's really important that all of us are educated, not only the public but ourselves, to understand how our business operates. And this is really what comes down. So I know you mentioned that you have a manual, right? So for me, I'm thinking, where was Rachel 9 years ago when I started my company? Like, where do I get this resource? And so how do people get the manual? How they get that information? How is it cultivated per state that everyone operates in?
So it's basically a national manual that is for most of how it is operated within most states. But we also have specific chapter on licensing. So we go through each state. We get into detail on what specific requirements are for that individual state's requirements for licenses. We have it available on our website, and you can download that as a PDF version. We've also turned it into learning modules, so that way you can, if you want to learn about construction contracts, for example, what clauses you need in your contract, how to protect yourself and cover yourself, we have a learning module just on that. If you want to learn about lien laws, how liens are the typical lien law, the filing procedures, who has to file liens, what your requirements are for that, we have a module for that. And we actually created, I don't think I told you, but we created an exclusive coupon code just for your listeners. So we have a 10% off coupon code for everyone. That is AFT-10. So for any of our courses or services on our site, you can check that out and get 10% off.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to put that in the show notes, because I know there's a lot of contractors always asking, well, what do I do? What are next steps? In fact, I have an employee right now that's going to go off on his own, that's been working to that. That was always his goal, to start his own remodeling company. And, he's always asking where he started, and it's so complex. And that's where, I look back that if I had a resource such as you, Rachel, where I could go on to your website, and understand, how do I set up a contract, right? What clauses do I need to have? What protection? Thinking about the lien and licensing. I mean, these are expensive lessons. If you don't have the right person on the other side to consult with, right, that's going to help you out and walk you through this, it can be a very expensive learning opportunity.
Definitely. As they say, you're a contractor, you have tools in your toolbox, whether they're physical tools or virtual tools, business tools. These are just things to add to your toolbox that can help you just jumpstart it that much more.
I love that. So to change this a little bit, what's interesting is I know a lot of contractors struggle with understanding the bond, right? What's a construction bond? And even clients have a hard time understanding. So explain a little bit about what is a construction bond.
So there's different types of construction bonds. When you say construction bond, it could mean one thing to one person where it would mean something else to another. There's licensing bonds, where when you go to get your license, you may have to obtain a bond to make sure that if something happens, the county can reimburse someone for a violation of, let's say, a regulation, for example. There's also payment bonds to make sure that all of your subcontractors are paid on the job. There's performance bonds and payment and performance bonds. These would be like required for your government project, your public funded projects, they would require your payment in performance bonds, but performance bond makes sure that someone's going to complete that job, whether it's you, the bonded contractor, or someone else that the surety company then designates to finish that project out. So it's just a double assurance for the owner of the project or the public to be protected for performance bond. Then there's maintenance bonds. There's conditional payment bonds. You can have lien bonds to get someone who's maybe, if the owner hasn't paid something and you want to close out a lien, you can get a lien bond to bond around a lien being filed. There's supplier bonds to make sure that all the suppliers are paid. So there's a lot of different types of bonds in the construction industry that, contractors, most of them don't, they say licensed, bonded, and insured, but do they really know what the bond means? Like, what bond are we talking about,
Yeah, it's funny you say that because you always see licensed, bond, insured, but do they understand what the bond is or what it's for, when it's required? For those working in residential, they may not see it as often as they will in commercial, especially if you're doing government work, right? They're going to require bonds. If you're doing a school or government work, they're going to have you put up a payment bond and performance bond both. I will say that we're doing a residential project, and it's a little unique. It's an amazing custom home. It's on a hillside. It's 14 acres of private hillside. But what's unique is that their property is attached to an existing community. So there's a gated community, so you have to drive through the community to the end of the cul-de-sac, and that's where you now have access to go up the hillside. Well, the HOA, they could say, okay, well, you may be licensed and insured, Brad, but you're going to be bringing in, 50 concrete trucks through our neighborhood. You're going to be doing work, on our streets and our pavement. And so we were required to put up a $250,000 bond, right? A performance bond to work in this community. And really, at the end of the day, it gives the HOA assurance that, hey, if we damage a curb, damage the street, maybe even damage our residential vehicles as we're going in and out access, right? That we're going to step behind and pay for that, or, being bonded, that our bonding company will, which then if I don't step up to the plan my bonding company does, that's going to penalize me for future bonds, right?
Oh yeah, that would jack your rates up for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bonds are expensive enough.
They are expensive, and so part of that bonding, it's really important to understand, so where if I had to get a bond, and let's say I had no experience, Rachel, where do I go to get bonded, whether it be a performance bond or a payment bond?
So typically this is your insurance agent's wheelhouse. They have the contacts with the surety companies, they have contacts with bonding companies or general agents that will be dealing with bonds. They'll usually deal with the bonding company. So there are some companies that just specialize in bonds, construction bonds and other types of bonds. But typically your insurance agent, you just contact your local agent, whoever does your general liability or your commercial auto insurance would be able to get you sourced for those things. And being a new contractor, you may be paying a little bit of a premium price, but at least once you get bonded, that's the most generally you're going to pay, unless you do some no-no stuff and they have to take over. But you'll see experience modification factors. And when they say that, that's you have more experience in the field, you've completed more projects, we trust you a little bit more, we'll give you more of a discount off your bond the next time. So when you go to renew those things, they tend to get a little bit cheaper unless you,
failed.
End up, not completing a project.
Yeah, I love these shows, Rachel, because one thing that's key too for people to understand is that a lot of times, especially as a new company, if you don't have a track record or you haven't been in business maybe a year and you don't have financials and you're working through, they could ask for a personal guarantee too, where they're saying, okay, Rachel, if I'm going to bond you and your company, first of all, the rate may be a little bit higher, the cost may be higher, but in addition, you're going to have to give a personal guarantee, which then changes it as well. And so it's really important, as a contractor, to understand, well, what am I signing when I'm signing a personal guarantee? What's my liability personally? Because I may have to do that at any rate just to get the bond, to get the project.
Yeah. And it's the difference between getting the project and not getting the project sometimes. If you don't have the bond or the bond's too much and you can't afford it, you don't have the capital to put it out. All the more reason to plan ahead and have your financials in place and have your, get those things in place personally so that you have the credit to be able to back your business to get those bonds later on down the line.
So outside of bonding, how does a contractor know if they're properly insured?
They got to look at their exclusions. They have to look at their policy, read the policy documents, read what's covered and what's excluded, and what you have for endorsements. When you look at your policy coverage, you really need to know what's covered. If you have an admitted carrier, generally most items will be included. You'll have a lot of standard endorsements included in your packages, but if it ends up being a surplus lines carrier, maybe someone through Lloyd's of London or some other general agent that has a surplus lines type of a policy, there's usually more exclusions with that. So you really need to keep an eye on the exclusions. It's not what's covered, it's what's not covered. So read those things, that fine print. You got to make sure you have your general liability coverage. You definitely need to make sure you have your commercial auto policy coverage. You have to have workers' comp coverage. And then a lot of times bigger contractors will also get excess liability or umbrella liability policies to cover over top of everything in case you exceed policy limits on something, or you have 2 or 3 lawsuits in a policy period and it's now in excess. That kicks in and that covers you so it doesn't come after you personally. So
yeah, I love that you share that, because this has been, I feel for me, it's been the most complex, that over time, because it's one thing to understand our exposure or my exposure as a business owner, from general liability to auto, commercial auto, workman's comp, bodily injury, all these different things that aspect the job. But where it becomes really tricky is making sure that the trade partners I'm hiring, that they have the proper insurance too, that I'm auditing their policy, getting all their documents and understanding what they're excluding, what they're including, understanding their limits, right? When does it cap for them? We're now, for something that they're causing, that now I'm taking the bulk of it. And that's where I feel that most contractors, especially in all the seminars I've sat through, that we just aren't looking enough at those that we're hiring, performing the work, to making sure that they're properly insured.
yeah, as contractors, we have the duty as the prime contractor to make sure that our subs and everyone underneath of us are operating to our standards, and also to make sure that they have the insurance limits that will cover us. So if their insurance limits are only 300,000 and ours are 1 million or 2 million, and they mess up the stucco and now you have a $500,000 lawsuit on your hands, their policy limits are going to pay out, and then the contractor's looking to you to pay. They're coming after you to recover as the contractor. So your homeowners, it's a flow down and flow back up. It goes both ways. You as the contractor have to supervise your subs, but their insurance will look to your insurance to recover. If you get sued, you're going to look to their insurance to recover. So you want to make sure that their insurance has enough that they're going to cover everything, and they don't have exclusions for the type of work they're doing. Like if they're doing stucco installation and they have a specific exclusion on an exterior finish or exterior coverings, and they do stucco, they're not going to cover that policy. It's basically like they don't even have a policy.
Right.
So yours will kick in.
So true.
It's that's how it goes. When there's a defects case, you one person gets sued, the GC, and then who does he sue? He subrogates and he third party sues all of the subs, and then their insurance companies. So it's a flow down, trickle down effect when it comes to that.
I love that you share that, because that understand the subrogation is important. But when you think about, and I've seen that before, that in some of these trade partners that have insurance, and as you mentioned, a good example, not that this happened with my stucco guy, but what you're saying is that the stucco company is performing an exterior finish, yet they're excluding any liability for exterior finish. So really you're hiring someone that if there is a defect, they're out. Essentially, they have no liability. Now you as a general contractor do, and that's why it's really important that it's not just, hey, these handshake, going back to the importance of a contract, is that not only is the contract super important because it protects not only the trade partner, but us as well, as we're working through this and understand the correct scope and application. But when it comes to defects too, that we're understanding that the insurance now is going to back the work that both of us are doing.
Definitely. And making sure that, that you have up-to-date certificates of insurance, that you don't have an old one, that you're named as a certificate holder. And most
additional
of our,
insured.
I was going to say, most of our policies require us to make them list us as additional insured, so that we are insured on their policy as much as the liability that we're taking by hiring them.
Yeah, I love that, because that's something as well that, most of, when I'm working for, clients or developers, they'll ask to be additional insured. We'll do the same for our trade partners. because then for sure with the certificates of insurance, understand that the policy's not lapsing, getting those updated certificates. And that's where it's really important when you start thinking about all the complexities of business. There has to be some sort of organization internally that you have someone assigned to this that does, because when you're doing 10 projects a year and you have 50 people on each job, I mean, you could have 500 companies easily doing work, right? 50, whatever it may be. And you have to track to make sure, hey, they're good today. We're in November and their policy's good, but it expires January, 15th. So we better make sure January, that week that we're getting a new updated certificate of insurance to make sure that they're good to go for the following year.
Even further than that, I always check their insurance before I pay them.
Yeah, that's really smart. So it's one of the checklist items.
So yes, as a check before I issue before we sign off on the lien paperwork and we send we get all of that. We get our lien paperwork, we get, the check, and we check on their insurance. We verify it with the agent or request another certificate of insurance to make sure that it's still valid, because just because it says it's good for 6 months doesn't mean that they didn't just get it and then cancel their policy. We've seen it happen. So it's definitely something to consider, because you just never know. And before the end of the project, making sure that their insurance is still in place too.
I actually love that checklist item, because typically when you give them a check, at least for us, they're providing a lien release, that they're signing the lien release as we hand them the check, right? There's that crossover there. But yeah, never thought about, hey, make sure we have our updated certificate. We work with good vendors, but still, as you mentioned, there's still some where you just never know. And, what better way to hold their feet to the fire than when you're paying them, right?
For sure. Definitely. It's the surefire way to get it turned around quickly.
Absolutely. So what about builder's risk? I mean, do you recommend that GCs, whether they're doing a remodel or new build, that they always are adamant that the owner get a builder's risk policy?
Definitely, for sure, because you have no idea what could happen to your stuff, your materials, your job site that's unsecured. You have no idea what could happen. Vandalism. I can't tell you how many job sites we go by where things get, walk off the job site overnight, or kids decide to vandalize things, or God forbid the homeowner go on the project and they're the one that wants to watch the progress of the project and goes on site and, trips on something, steps on a nail, whatever. It's still an issue, still some sort of a coverage and a liability that you definitely need to make sure that you're covering. And it's not even expensive when you consider the amount of coverage for how long a project could go on. I mean, you could have a custom build take, 6 months, a year and a half, depending on materials. So to have that builder's risk coverage in place for the duration of the project, not to mention most lenders are going to require it anyway. So just making sure that you have that as well is always a good idea for you and the homeowner. Protects everyone.
Yeah, and that's something that we've always done it, but this is something we're having the conversation early on about, the builder's risk, and we'll assist our clients to get quotes too, because that's a policy that they're taking on. And as you mentioned, whether it be injury or vandalism or theft, these things happen, or let's say by accident, the house could burn down and burn the neighbor's house down. Whatever. All this stuff, is protecting the client and us, from potential issues that may come. And again, that's something that's a lot less expensive if they're contracting it before the project starts, because sometimes you can't even get a builder's risk once you start construction, and sometimes they can, but it's very expensive. And so, that's something that most contractors need to understand. And yeah, I think what's interesting with you, Rachel, that I've found is, not only are you super savvy in regard to business, and all this assistance you give us contractors, but you're also running your own company, aren't you, in Florida?
Yes, myself and some business partners, we have a custom residential design, build, construction business. So we do some high-end custom projects. Basically, we work with them and the architects and design it the way they want. So with that, there's a lot of details and a lot of specifications that we have to look at all the time, and sourcing materials. But we give allowances just to make sure that we're not running into cost issues, budget issues, especially with these supply increases. Just through the moon right now.
Crazy.
You have no idea. You can't secure how long that price will last for. So we've been getting by with just allocated allowances. You're designing this the way you want it. So if you want travertine marble in the backyard, it's a change order. here's 15,000 for decking. If it's 30, then there's a $15,000 change order, So that helps to absorb and sort of protect ourselves from those rising material costs. We have those things in place, but it's definitely, we've had to switch and change quick to doing that and being resilient to being able to, jump and change with just ever changing market conditions and supply and demand logistic issues. So
Oh, I feel for you. It's so hard right now. But what's interesting, for you being design build, so are you controlling, the architecture, the design process, as well as the build all the way through?
I work with an architect and a draftsperson, and we design it. So we we'll look at some floor plans to get an idea and then modify it from there. What do they want in here? How do they want the ceilings? What do they want the outside to look like? We just go with aesthetics and go through finishes, and I help them pick out materials. And so it's a whole thing. I have a source of, material houses that know how we work. So they work with us, and they, give them the rundown and the models of everything so they can pick and choose. And then we just go from there. But the architect's dealing with them, and we got to change this. Okay, now she wants 3 feet more in the bathroom. Okay, now we got to move this wall. We need a bigger pantry, and we need to add some electrical load here because we're going to do a theater. So it's a little different. It's more, I think, than what most contractors do, because not everybody does the design build and works with the architect, but a lot do. So it definitely helps with teaching contractors, because I work with plans, I work with architects, I work with a lot of those things, so I can help explain those things to everyone else.
So as busy as you are running your own company, design build there in Florida, and then what gave you the, I shouldn't say the energy, but at least the desire to start the Contractor Training Center, right? I mean, there's just so much to that to have. I understand the business very well, so that's very helpful, as a consultant, but, it's such a different business model, and there's so much to it.
So the partners, the directors of Contractor Training Center they've been running this for about 6 years, and they found me, and I was already working with another construction training company, and they just said, hey, we want you to come on board, come work with us, help us take this thing nationwide. And I was like, I love it. I love training. I love educating and furthering and expanding people's repertoires of their knowledge. And I feel like we provide a service to the industry. We provide things that people may not be able to find elsewhere. Construction specific education that helps people expand their business, and giving them pathways to attain a license is, you teach a man to fish. You give a man a fish, he only eats a day. You teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime. So I love that idea, and I love helping people kind of achieve their dreams. So it was just the perfect storm of amazingness, and I had to jump on board.
So what are some of the aspects when you think about the Contractor Training Center? If I'm just starting my company, Brad Levitt, today, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that they could go on and they could purchase the manual, right? They could understand, some language to set up their contracts. I mean, is this a course, a continual online education? Is it, this helps me prepare for the licensing exam in my state? I mean, what are all the different features and functions through the website, through the company?
So the Contractor Startup Toolkit is a manual that helps you you don't know where to start, here's where you start. So you get that manual, and then from there you decide what state that you would need to get licensed in, and we offer exam prep courses and book packages for those states. We also have licensing specialists that help you understand what the requirements are for each state. So they specialize in, this state requires this, you have to have this for experience, your financials have to look like this, you have to take your exam first, you have to apply for the exam first. Some states require you to apply and prove your experience first. Some just let you go take the test first and then get the license. So we have licensing specialists that help with that. And then once you have your license, we have professional development courses to help you keep your license. Some states require you to take continuing education to keep your licenses every 2 years or every 3 years, depending on your renewal. Others don't have any requirements for CE, but it's always a good idea to keep expanding your knowledge base. So we have construction specific professional development hours to help people sort of expand their their business
Arsenal.
toolkit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, it's super valuable because I mean, just in Arizona, for example, if you're to go get licensed, I know for me, the state's going to require for me to get the license, I have it as, B1 contractor. I had to show that I had, 5 years experience doing the size of projects that I'm doing. And fortunately I had that. But again, there's a lot of references you have, from clients and trade partners and suppliers, right? That all have to back say, yeah, I worked with Brad, in this role, as well as, the testing, preparing for the licensing. And so all this is something that you'll help us with, Rachel, to get through, get all the references and make sure that we're qualified to get the license we're applying for.
Yes. And some states require credit reports and fingerprints. Then, some have multiple exams. You may have a business and finance exam. You may have a technical exam or a 2-part technical exam. And then in some states, they even have you specialize within that. So our licensing specialists just really tailor it to you and help you navigate the whole process. There's a lot of red tape that's involved.
Way too much red tape. And I love the continuing education, the CE. I mean, it's so valuable because that's something that all of us, I mean, the reality is the industry changes all the time. There's new technology, new information, risk that we're dealing with that changes, right? And so understanding, OSHA and, all this CE, I mean, that's really valuable, to have someone provide that service as well.
Definitely. Well, we love doing it, and we're always rolling new things out. So keep checking out the site, our website, contractortrainingcenter.com, to see all of our new course offerings and keep up with our new course launches.
Well, to close here, you've been very gracious with your time, Rachel. So thank you for that. And, as we close here, what's the best advice you've been given?
I would say the best advice that I have been given is choose your clients wisely. Because know when to fire a client. Sometimes you may need to fire a client. If it seems like it's going to be a headache or you have a nightmare contract, a nightmare homeowner that is nitpicking every little thing, that is just scrutinizing every detail, it may be a blessing in disguise. Sometimes it's easier and less headache and frustration in the long run to sometimes be able to just say, I'm going to walk away from this one and let it be someone else's headache. But I would say that's probably the best advice. I think I've dodged a couple bullets that way. But I think that the ability of someone to be resilient is also key. So always be learning is the other thing that I would say is the best advice. Just always be learning, always be conscious, and be open to change, because sometimes things will change around you if you don't change.
Well, I love that. I mean, we've spent a lot of time on this podcast trying to understand your ideal client, right? How to vet your client. I mean, it's so important, and understand how to be resilient, especially in construction. I mean, it's a very demanding industry. It's a very complicated industry, and it can be tough. It's very challenging at times. So, for you, Rachel, what's upcoming and exciting?
Upcoming and exciting, we are getting ready to launch a national electrical program. So we are rolling out electrical courses in, I think, 15 states. It's going to be very exciting. So I've been wrapping my head around electrical lately, which is super fun. It's exciting. So other than that, just building more houses, trying to keep up and keep busy and continue to evolve with everything and stay ahead of the market.
Which is amazing. Well, in closing here, where can our listeners find you? And again, that website to sign up, for the Contractor Training Center.
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, and our website is contractortrainingcenter.com. And we do have a coupon code for your listeners, AFT-15. It's 15% off.
Oh, wow. So it just went up if they finished the episode.
Just went up 5%, yes.
Well, that's amazing, Rachel. I can't thank you enough for making time and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it. And it was great working with you today.
So thank you all for tuning into the podcast today. And just as a recap, if you check the show notes, they're just going to have all the links for the topics that we discuss, and also one of our favorite features now
is the chapters that go through the conversation. So if there's certain topics you want to revisit or listen to, they're outlined by the time that we discuss those. And again, we can't thank you enough for all of your support. Please make sure and download our podcast, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and review wherever you download your podcast.